so prepare to crush the weakling followers of the Emperor under the heavy firepower of Perturabo. Let's talk heavy armor, hazard stripes, and chaos firepower with an overview of the Iron Warriors in Warhammer 40K. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics and Iron Within, Iron Without. In today's video we're taking a look at another Chaos Space Marine Legion, and this time it's time to take a look at the Iron Warriors and how they play in current 40k. We'll look over their current in-game performance, the special rules of their army, including their Legion traits and unique stratagems and Warlord traits and things, talk about perhaps some of the strongest units for the army in the current game, and finish up with one competitive tournament list. I've done a similar style of video for most of the other Chaos Space Marine Legions now, and I'll be aiming to get the others done over the next week or two. I'm sure most of you watching are well aware, but the Iron Warriors are Chaos Space Marine Legion, not dedicated to any one Chaos God, the Siege Masters under the thrall of their Primarch Perturabo, bitter enemies of the Imperial Fists, and Chaos Space Marines with a liking for heavy firepower and smashing enemy formations and fortifications with overwhelming force. In the previous edition of the Codex they were one of the most played Chaos Space Marine Legions competitively, but unfortunately while Chaos Space Marines have generally got better as a faction, the Iron Warriors don't seem to be one of the top dogs within that faction, at least in terms of competitive games right now. Looking at tournament win rate data at the moment, it does appear that Iron Warriors are one of the more challenging armies to win with. They've only got a 40% win rate in competitive events, compared with Chaos Space Marines in general who have a 50% chance. The Iron Warriors do seem to be doing the worst alongside World Eaters. Obviously tournament win percentages aren't everything, but I must admit it's not necessarily the most encouraging news for the faction. I do feel like they have some really powerful tricks within their own unique special rules, but maybe I feel like they're just not doing quite as well, as the Chaos Space Marine Codex tends to be really quite melee heavy and have some really powerful close combat datasheets, and maybe just the firepower and durability tricks of the Iron Warriors just maybe aren't as naturally suited to the best things in Codex Chaos Marines. Still though, I do think that they can be very strong with an optimised list and a skilled player. I feel like maybe their tournament stats might be slightly hindered by maybe some top players not choosing to play them as much as other armies. They do have some powerful tricks, including getting more out of the firepower units that Chaos has to offer, plus some really nasty durability stuff, for example some of the toughest Terminator bricks around. In any case though, let's get into the good stuff and talk about the strengths of the Legion. So first up, their trait is fittingly entitled Iron Within, Iron Without. This allows the Iron Warriors to ignore cover both at range and also in melee as well. It applies to both dense cover and light cover, and I guess heavy cover in combat too. And all around that is quite helpful to have in 9th edition with terrain dense battlefields. Certainly a lot more useful for shooting rather than combat, though occasionally it might help out in combat for things like enemy units fighting behind barricades. It's certainly pretty good for any of their low AP firepower and not having stacking light cover on enemy saves. Otherwise, their second part is updated in the balance data slate. Initially it was a bit of AP manipulation, but seeing as Armour of Contempt is a thing, that's been changed to a defensive buff where it means that enemy armies can't reroll wound rolls against Iron Warriors. As an extra defensive ability, it's helpful but very unreliable. Some armies just literally will not care about that rule at all, where others might be really quite hindered by it. For example, if the opponent's brought, say, a Primaris Lieutenant along, their rerolls will be worthless. Same if they have some inbuilt army-wide mechanic to get a wound reroll, or certain bits of war gear like lightning claws where they'll basically just turn into fancy power weapons without their wound reroll. Handy when it matters, but I must admit having a very matchup dependent defensive trait wouldn't be quite as useful as maybe a more minor buff that is a bit more universal. They've got a unique secondary objective, this one called Masters of Demolition. This one's a Shadow Ops one, and unfortunately it is kind of dreadful. The way it works is that the enemy sets up 3 objectives that are greater than 6 inches from a board edge, greater than 9 inches from each other, and only one within 6 inches of their drop zone. Your Iron Warrior infantry units have to do an action on them, and they can only do it at the start of the movement phase, so presumably after they've weathered a turn of enemy firepower, and also if there aren't any enemies on the objective. Again, this is just very easy to prevent. If you manage to do the action, then you get 4 victory points for each one destroyed, and an extra 3 victory points if you get the one in your opponent's deployment zone. Overall, this just really stacks up to be one of the worst secondary objectives in 9th edition. I think it's going to be very rare that you'd have a game that you wouldn't be better off taking either Raise the Banners or Retrieve Data rather than this. Certainly doesn't help at all with Chaos Space Marines' fairly marginal secondaries. Next up though, and far more positively, are the stratagems. I feel that perhaps the stratagems and the Warlord traits are perhaps some of the biggest reasons to take Iron Warriors, as they do have quite a lot of usable stuff. There's a 1 CP matchup dependent one versus Imperial Fists, Fighting in melee, you get to reroll all hits and wounds. That's a massive damage buff against Imperial Fists, but they're kind of rare as a sub-faction, so largely that's just going to be a fun and fluffy one for when it crops up. For 1 CP though, we've got Tank Destroyers. For this one you get to choose one enemy vehicle, and then for the rest of your turn, Iron Warrior Heretic Astartes units get 6s to hit auto wound, both at range and melee against that vehicle target. I do quite like that one, to be honest. Potentially really nice for focusing down one big enemy vehicle threat. I guess it is dependent on them having vehicles, but if you're playing say Imperial or Chaos Knights, then this one's going to be absolutely invaluable. It even means that a bunch of small arms or light combat attacks could actually cause some serious damage. Having a whole bunch of attacks bypassing the wound roll is pretty great. Next up, and one of the best stratagems out of them I think, is Dour Duty. This is 1 or 2 CP, depending on whether or not they're power 10 or more. You select an Iron Warrior's core infantry unit or demonkin. When that unit is attacked, they get -1 damage on the attacks coming in. -1 damage is an absolutely great defensive stratagem to have access to, and it's at a pretty reasonable cost as well. It'll cost you 2 CP if you're applying it to some very big scary bricks of Terminators, but it's pretty usable on smaller units as well. Maybe things like Possessed, it would only cost 1 CP. Similar for Chaos Legionaries. It's particularly great if you know that you're going to get shot by, say, a damage 2 weapon versus 2 wound Legionaries. That's basically going to cut your opponent's damage output in half. The same thing as well if, say, you've got some Possessed and they're getting shot by damage 3 guns. It'll make them a lot more survivable and is likely to be a really good return on investment there. I think that stratagem alone adds quite a lot of survivability to the Iron Warriors army. Next up, for 1 CP, there's Cold-Hearted Malignity. 1 core unit below half strength gets to auto-pass morale and +1 to hit for the rest of the game. Kind of situational that one, as it's dependent on your units getting less than half strength, but also still being big enough that they're worth using this stratagem on. I probably wouldn't plan on this one, but say for example, if you had 4 Terminators left out of a unit of 10, it seems pretty reasonable. A game long +1 to hit could well be worth the CP cost. Next up, we've got Methodical Annihilation. This one feels like it's a damage output boost aimed at really big guns, and for 1 Iron Warrior shooting you get to re-roll the damage roll. Blast weapons count any squads that they take aim at as having double the numbers in them, and vehicles can also fire blast weapons within engagement range, though any ones to hit the enemy unit cause you a mortal wound instead. This one feels like it's usually going to be best on a D6 shot weapon with a random number of damage. Maybe the Vindicator isn't the worst target in the world. In the new book it got updated to D3+3 shots, but still could be potentially handy if it swings the unit into getting the max shots against it, and then re-rolling any low rolls on that D6 damage isn't too bad either. Perhaps could be okay on something like the Demon Gore Cannon on a Khorne Lord of Skulls as well, if you happen to be using one of those. The shooting and combat thing I think is pretty handy for Vindicators too. It makes them a bit more usable than Iron Warriors, as otherwise they're quite easily countered by locking them up if the opponent does have something that moves fast and is quite expendable. Otherwise, we've got Unholy Vigour, -1 to wound for a Machine Spirit or Demon Engine vehicle. It's 2 CP for most units, or 3 CP for Titanics. -1 to wound is really quite a nasty debuff. Against dedicated anti-tank weapons, wounding vehicles on 3s normally, then it'd be kind of equivalent to transhuman physiology there, but it maybe particularly shines if, say, you had a Land Raider being shot with las cannons, wounding on 4s and then suddenly going to 5s. It is a bit on the pricey side though, so maybe it has to be used on something that is absolutely going to get focused. For 2 CP, there's Cannon Fodder. This one's an infantry unit that's less than 6 inches from cultists, and that unit can't be shot if the cultists are a closer viable target to the enemy. It is a bit on the pricey side, and if the opponent has the anti-infantry just to clear those cultists away anyway, then it's going to be a little bit less useful. If you have something at least fairly tanky though, say a big unit of accurted cultists, or maybe some traitor guardsmen in cover, stopping the enemy from putting valuable shots into something very, very expensive could be good. Maybe this one might not be too bad for protecting things like, say, Terminators, or perhaps Obliterators or Havocs maybe. Still though, a bit on the pricey side if you want to rely on it for more than one turn. Finally, for 1 CP, there's Spiteful Endurance, a 1 CP to give a 5+ save against mortal wounds to any Heretic Astartes unit. This one's nice, simple and effective to be honest. Mortal wounds are pretty much everywhere in 9th edition. Being able to just pop up a save against them for 1 CP will often be worth the trade. If you're just about to eat something like 1000 Suns or Zenith's Psychic Phase, then that could well be worth the trade-off and save far more models than 1 CP is worth. Quite a nice option, as most Chaos Space Marines don't get this. Overall, out of these ones, I think quite a lot are usable, but a few are maybe just a little on the pricey side. My favourite out of any of them is Dour Duty for the -1 damage. That's really nice when you can get it for 1 CP in particular. Otherwise, Tank Hunters is very efficient if you're firing against one very big vehicle in the middle of the board, and the 5+ save against mortal wounds I think will be relevant in a fair few matchups. Moving on, I feel like the Warlord Traits are another one of the stronger sections of the Iron Warriors sub-codex. Really quite a lot of buffing abilities in these ones, perhaps a bit more suited for commanders supporting guns. First up, we've got Siege Lord. A single core or vehicle unit within 6 inches gets +1 damage with its strength 7 or more weapons when you're attacking vehicles. I guess the theory with this one might be that you could support some las cannon havoc squads perhaps, or perhaps something with a bunch of anti-tank guns like maybe a Forge Fiend's ectoplasma. I feel like the problem with this one though is that you have to be targeting vehicles, and if you happen to be matching up against an army that doesn't take any, then you've basically wasted a Warlord trait. I guess it's very good if you're absolutely certain that you're fighting vehicles, and particularly if you are bringing something really massive along that's worth buffing, maybe something like a Chaos Super Heavy. Next up we've got Demon Smith, one unit less than 6 inches that can either be a Demon Engine, Cult of Destruction or Machine Spirit unit, gets +1 to hit. This one's maybe a bit more of a general purpose one if you are buffing one of those targets. Seems like a solid choice if you are taking some Obliterators along, having them hit on 2s rather than 3s. Unyielding Metal is a rather nice toughness trait, +1 toughness for your Warlord and a 5+ feel no pain as well, a flat upgrade on one of the generic traits. Seems very nice for something like a Heretic Astartes Demon Prince or a Lord Discordant, both bits would be handy. Very good as a defensive buff if you're hit by anything strength 6 or 7. Bastion I think is a really solid one. One core unit within 6 inches always gets to either hold steady or set to defend, potentially giving you 5+ overwatch or +1 to hit in combat when charged, and also gets objectives secured, or if they already have it, then they count as doubling it. Chaos don't really have all that many options for handing out objectives secured to units, so this one just seems like a match made in heaven for Terminators. They can be massively tough and even more so in Iron Warriors, so giving them objectives secured really just guarantees they dominate an objective. It's a pretty nice side effect that they also like the +1 to hit in combat if charged as well, that certainly won't hurt. Architect of Destruction is a buff for your heavy weapons or bolt weapons. One core or vehicle unit within 6 inches counts as being in Wanton Destruction rather than the current Wanton rule. Exploding hits with 6s with things like heavy weapons, that's going to be more meaningful on the bigger the unit that you can target with it. Again, seems like a very tasty one if you were bringing something like a Lord of Skulls along. Maybe a little bit more passable on more medium-sized units though, with just some standard heavy weapons. Finally, Implacable Taskmaster is a 6-inch aura for core units. They count as stationary if they made a normal move, so basically that's going to be good for triggering Bolter Discipline or moving and shooting with heavy weapons, though I must admit I don't really think that there's all that many units that make amazing use of that. Havocs get to move and fire anyway, so they don't care. I guess in theory this could be best for standard Legionaries, but to be honest, Legionaries just aren't very good damage dealers with standard bolters and heavy weapons. Not really a unit that's massively worth building around for range damage. Overall though, I do think the Warlord trait is a pretty strong section. Bastion seems like it could be a very easy pickup for competitive lists with a big block of Terminators. Unyielding Metal is a really good defensive buff, and the 3 buffing traits all could be interesting depending on what units you're fielding. Lastly, for unique rule sections, we have the Relics, and again I think some of these are usable, a few are a bit more passable though. The Axe of the Forge Master is an okay combat weapon. One axe becomes strength +3, AP -3 and damage 2, with 1 mortal wound on 6s, or 3 mortal wounds if you're fighting vehicles. Generally speaking, I think you're usually going to be better off with the demon weapons than that one. The Siegebreaker Mace replaces a Maw, Thunderhammer, Crozius or Accursed weapon, strength +2, AP -2 and damage 2, plus you get 1 additional attack at double strength, AP 3 and damage D3 +3. I think that would have been quite interesting if you could have taken it on a unit sergeant, but I'm still not sure it's quite good enough for use on a character. The Flesh Metal Exoskeleton though I think is a bit cooler. This one's only relevant if you're using an infantry character though. Each time an attack's allocated to it, it gets -1 damage, and also regenerates D3 wounds on a 4+, each time the bearer gets attacked and loses a wound. I guess this one is kind of dependent on using something like a Terminator character rather than a Lord Discordant or a Demon Prince for a fighty character, but I guess at least on paper you could make a stupidly durable Terminator character, maybe between this and Unyielding Metal. The Cranium Malevolus is a mortal wound chance if you get close to enemy vehicles. You roll a d6 per vehicle within 9 inches when you're shooting. On a 4 or 5 they take d3 mortal wounds, or on a 6 they take 3. Cultists can take that one as well, so you could take it on a Dark Commune. And again, for me, this one's just a bit too matchup dependent. Okay if you're fighting vehicles, though even then you'd have to get right in amongst them to actually make it worth it, but it could be useless in other games. Insidium is a non-demon infantry unit, gaining demon and demonkin, and getting +1 strength, toughness and wound. Again, a pretty fun all-round upgrade there, would work well on a Terminator character, though again, as with a few of the other infantry locked upgrades, if you really want to do stack Warlord Traits and Relics on things, it's usually going to be better on either a Lord Discordant or a Demon Prince, I feel. Next up, we've got Spire Spitter, a combi weapon or combi bolter, gets a 30-inch rapid fire 2-shot, strength 5, AP 3 and damage 2, though it's only rapid fire 1 if it's just one half of a combi weapon. Honestly, I think that this one isn't too bad for a gun upgrade. If you do have a Terminator combi bolter lying around, then changing out 4 strength 4 damage 1 shots for 4 with strength 5 damage 2 and good AP is really quite a big difference. With combi bolters, you could pretty much guarantee this will be firing on multiple turns, so should probably pay back the investment if you have one. Finally, we've got the Techno-Venomous Mecha Tendrils, which I think is really quite a fun relic. This one's locked to the Warpsmith only, allows you to repair 3 wounds with his Master of Mechanisms thing, and when you make attacks with the Mecha Tendrils, each of the 4 attacks converts to a mortal wound if it hits, meaning that you're going to average somewhere like 2 or 3 mortal wounds out of this guy each time he fights, never mind his normal damage with his axe. Honestly, I think that this one is a really powerful incentive to actually run a Warpsmith in an Iron Warriors army. Massively better repairing, and more mortal wounds to boot. So bringing this all together, which units will be strongest for Iron Warriors, and what might be some of the better selectable options to enhance them? First up, with the various options available, I do feel that Obliterators might be one of the more relevant ones in Iron Warriors. If they're going to work anywhere in the Chaos Codex, it's probably here. Ignoring cover is pretty nice, and so is that Warlord trait that can give them a +1 to hit. Otherwise, just about any vehicles or ranged units are going to be a little bit better in Iron Warriors than most other legions. Things like Havocs, Venom Crawlers, Vindicators, all for various reasons might be a bit more tempting. Ignore cover is great, and I've got pretty good support with the Stratagems and Warlord traits. Cultists are maybe just a little bit more desirable in Iron Warriors as well, and that does include any of the variants, including the Accursed Cultist and Traitor Guardsman now. If you were using something like Havocs or Obliterators, then they could be better to screen. If that Cannon Fodder Stratagem ever does mean that you can basically save a unit to act again another turn, then it could well be worth the 2 CP. Terminators are of course a staple in just about every competitive Chaos list at the moment, particularly with that Black Rune of Damnation, but it's interesting that in Iron Warriors they're perhaps one of the single strongest incarnations of them. You can still stack things like Feel No Pain from Slanesh, Illusory Supplication, and Healing from a Master of Possession, but Iron Warriors also get to turn off all wound rerolls innately, and also have that stratagem for -1 damage if they are hit by anything nasty. You might also have a bit more scope for building around 2 super tanky units between the various durability buffs, rather than just going all in on one. The Siege Lord trait is also very nice for supporting them. Finally, for characters, I feel like buffing characters are maybe a bit better for Iron Warriors than most with those good Warlord traits available. The Master of Possession I think is a particularly strong pick, getting on well with both Obliterators and Terminators, and other standout HQs seem to be the Warpsmith, pretty much purely for those great Mecha Tendrils, the Lord Discordant as he's generally strong and also has Demon Engine synergies, and any characters in Terminator armour, just as they've got a fair few options that they wouldn't get in other legions. For Warlord traits and Relics, as we mentioned, I do think that Bastion might be one of the strongest, given that 2 Terminators is great. Otherwise the extra durability from Unyielding Metal is good, as are the buffs like Demonkin or Architect of Destruction. Not bad to throw on something like a buffing Warpsmith, Dark Apostle, or a Master of Possession. The Mecha Tendrils are a standout good relic, and perhaps one of the main reasons that you'd actually ever want to run a Warpsmith in Chaos Marines. And for the Stratagems, I do like their durability buffs, the -1 damage, the 5+ save against mortal wounds, 2 CP for -1 to wound against a Demon Engine, and 1 command point for tank destroyers to focus down one enemy tank. Finally, to round up and put some things together, here's just one example of someone who has managed to make Iron Warriors work, this list by Boyd Morale, who used it to take 3rd at RatCon GT. The list, as with just about every second Chaos list these days, is headed up by Abaddon the Despoiler, always a strong choice just on his own raw melee stats, never mind a few re-rolls like on the Terminators perhaps. To back him up, he's got a Lord Discordant on Hellstalker, that one takes a Bale Flamer and the Mark of Tzeentch to negate a saving throw each turn, and he takes that excellent Unyielding Metal trait alongside the Gorget of Eternal Hate. That one gives him a +1 to armor saves alongside a 4+ invul and some mortal wounds on death, so between all the stats buffs he is just going to be ridiculously hard to take out and a real anvil unit for the army. Then there's the Slanesh Master of Possession. This one takes the Liber Hereticus, Pact of Flesh and Warp Marked. Pact of Flesh could help out the Terminators, but this one particularly looks like it's set up to help the Obliterators. A +1 to wound on those flesh metal guns won't go down too badly. There's then 2 units of 10 cultists, usually could be just used for actions and objectives, but could maybe buy a turn of life for another unit if they wanted. 5 legionaries, which could be a good target for dour duty if they got shot by 2 damaged weapons, and then the fairly standard great big block of Terminators with the black rune, massively hard to kill. The Master of Possession could cast the 5+ Feel No Pain spell on them, being Slanesh, and they also take 4 Power Fists along for the ride as well. There's then that unit of 3 Obliterators, a solid amount of general purpose firepower with Ignore Cover, and it'd be pretty painful every time you can Pact of Flesh one back into existence. And finally, to round out the list, there's a clutch of Demon Engines, 3 cheap and effective Venom Crawlers, maybe to stomp up the board and screen the Lord Discordant perhaps. They can also help out the Master of Possession with their casting. Lastly, there's a Forge Fiend with the Ectoplasma Cannons, a little bit more shooting, and all of the Demon Engines could have -1 to wound for 2 CP if it made sense to. Overall, very cool to see a list where someone's managed to make Iron Warriors work, a few of the generic strong Chaos things taken along, but also some more unique and shooty Iron Warriors stuff with Obliterators, Venom Crawlers, the Forge Fiend, and the very, very tough Lord Discordant. So with that, I think we'll leave that there for the Iron Warriors today. Let me know what your experiences of them have been so far, and let me know what you think of their relative strength is to the other legions. Do they have one of the lowest win rates of the Chaos legions because they are genuinely a bit weak? Or are they just an underrated legion that people haven't discovered the potential of yet? As always, I look forward to reading your thoughts down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I will be hoping to cover the rest of the legions here on the channel in due course. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the stuff on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked down in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. The link's down in the video description if you're interested. In any case, an absolutely enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.